On the 11th of June, 1944, amid the rural landscape of Normandy, France, a mere 5 days following the D-Day invasion, a youthful American gunner, Elijah Carter by name, was positioned within a Sherman tank, observing the edge of the forest through his optical scope. Carter, a 23-year-old corporal hailing from Ohio, was under orders to maintain his post at a mire-filled intersection near a quaint French hamlet. The morning was expected to be uneventful. His team had established a defensive position, overseeing an unpaved road that wound between two dense sections of woodland. The atmosphere was motionless, thick with the scent of diesel, and the only audible disturbances were the far-off drone of machinery and the sporadic static from the radio. That is when he spotted it. Emerging from the mist and foliage, a German vehicle slowly came into sight. This was no ordinary Panzer. It lacked a primary cannon and had no discernible armor on its turret because it possessed no turret whatsoever. Instead, its form was a low, rectangular chassis with a tall radio antenna that extended to double the height of its hull. Several individuals were moving around it, their gestures conveying a sense of urgency. It was not moving to engage in combat. It was orchestrating. Carter recognized it immediately. It was a German command vehicle. The voice through his earpiece reiterated the standing directive. "Hold your fire, I repeat. Hold your fire." Awaiting confirmation of the target, he paused. All of his military conditioning urged him to hold back. No firing without authorization. No risk of unintended casualties. The crossroads might be teeming with non-combatants. However, the image in his lens suggested a different reality. This was no supply vehicle. This was not a mistakenly identified piece of farm equipment. This was the nerve center of an armored formation, and it was exposed. He glanced toward his commanding officer, who remained engrossed in a map, oblivious to the transient opportunity. Carter's finger lingered over the firing mechanism. Then, without uttering a sound, he discharged the weapon. The Sherman lurched back as a 75mm armor-piercing projectile erupted from its cannon, cutting through the dense June atmosphere. In under 3 seconds, the shell found its mark. The outcome would leave the Americans in shock, send the Germans into disarray, and shift the impetus of the Allied push in that area. A lone, unauthorized shot, discharged not from insubordination, but from pure instinct, would turn into one of the most pivotal choices made by any gunner during that entire campaign. And nobody anticipated it. A gunner by the name of Elijah Carter was no hero when he stepped onto the transport vessel bound for France. Born in the minor town of Newark, Ohio, in the spring of 1921, Carter was raised in a humble 2-bedroom house with his mother, a widowed nurse, and an elder brother employed at the local rail yards. His family had no history of military service, no lofty aspirations of fame, only hardened hands from summer work and a persistent feeling of duty that stuck to him like humidity in July. Prior to the war, he operated a delivery vehicle for a neighborhood bakery, manned the third base position for a local baseball team, and went to church on alternating Sundays. The war had felt remote, an affair of black and white print and radio reports. Yet, after the assault on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, that all changed. By April of 1942, Carter had enlisted in the United States Army. He did not await his draft notice. He opted for the Armor Division, not from a fondness for tanks, but from a conviction that it was where the most perilous tasks lay and where he could best contribute. His training took place at Fort Knox in Kentucky, where he was appointed to a Sherman tank crew as the main gunner. It was in that setting that he honed a keen eye for precision and a talent for appreciating silence. While his peers would shout and jest in the barracks, Carter preferred his own company, cleaning his optics, committing range tables to memory, and absorbing the low thrum of anticipation that resided in every soldier awaiting deployment. By the spring of 1944, his unit, which was a component of the 4th Infantry Division, had been transported to the southern shoreline of England. They endured nearly 6 weeks of almost continuous rain and mud, practicing beach assaults, combat maneuvers, and hedgerow warfare tactics. Spirits fluctuated with the ocean's tides. The precise date of the invasion was unknown to all. They were only certain that it was approaching, and that not all of them would return. Carter's crew came ashore on Utah Beach on the morning of June 6th. In contrast to the carnage at Omaha, their landing was comparatively uneventful, yet the ensuing days were far from peaceful. By the second week of June, the Germans had initiated a counteroffensive. The formidable panzer divisions, among them the elite Panzerlehr, had moved in to repel and halt the Allied drive inland. American tanks like Carter's Sherman found themselves in almost constant combat against vehicles that were heavier, more heavily armored, and crewed by more seasoned soldiers. The balance of power was rarely in their favor. However, Carter possessed an understanding that would soon be vital. At times in combat, intuition had to supplant official procedure. He was not the most skilled marksman in his battalion, but he was accurate. He was not the most courageous in his unit, but he was dependable. And most importantly, he was observant, which was the reason that 5 days later, when a German command vehicle edged into his line of sight, Carter identified the threat before anyone else. He comprehended what it was. He understood its significance, and he was certain that if he hesitated, it would vanish. The regulations that governed the days following the D-Day landings were not characterized by acts of valor. They were characterized by waiting. Having secured a narrow foothold inland from Utah Beach, Carter's tank crew was tasked with a methodical, careful advance southward through the Bocage region. It was a boundless terrain of tall hedges, sunken pathways, and frequent ambushes. It was a haven for snipers and a hell for tankers. By June 10th, the air was heavy with moisture and weariness. Intelligence indicated that German armored units were reorganizing. The Panzerlehr Division, one of the most disciplined and well-armed formations in the German military, had moved into the sector. The Americans harbored no misconceptions. Their Shermans were technologically inferior. For each American tank, the Germans possessed more powerful cannons, denser armor, and battle-hardened commanders. Consequently, the orders grew stricter, more rigid. No combat without explicit directives. Carter heard it time and again in briefings. You will not initiate fire unless you are fired upon first, or unless a higher authority confirms the target. End of story. There were justifications for this. The hedgerows severely limited visibility. American aircraft conducted regular missions overhead. A misidentification of a vehicle, even by a matter of seconds, could lead to friendly fire, the forfeiture of a position, or worse, civilians being caught in the exchange. In armored warfare, fire discipline was paramount. Commanders instilled it repeatedly. Await the command. Verify your distance. Re-verify your target. Do not make assumptions. Never make assumptions. Even within the cramped confines of a Sherman, the regulations held significance. The crew referred to Carter as the clock, not for his speed, but for his consistency. Under duress, he acted with a serene precision. He did not succumb to panic. He did not rely on guesswork. And now, for the first time, that composure was being tested. On the morning of June 11th, their Sherman, nicknamed Lucky 7, and stenciled in white on its turret, was one of 3 tanks positioned by a crossroads to the east of the village of Villers-Bocage. The infantry had not yet swept the woods to their east, so the tanks were under orders to maintain a defensive posture until reinforcements could arrive. The crew had been awake for close to 20 hours. Rest came in brief intervals, snatched between radio communications and the distant hum of activity. Around 11 o'clock, Carter was surveying the area through his periscope when he noticed it. An unusual silhouette advancing slowly along the dirt path that traversed the tree line. Its shape was unlike the Panzer IV he had been taught to identify in training. It was missing a turret. It had a taller frame and, what drew his attention most, an exceptionally large whip antenna extending from its rear. He looked closer. The vehicle was halting periodically, as if it were surveying or marking locations. Behind it, two other tanks followed, but at a more deliberate, cautious pace. This was no assault formation. This was a coordinated maneuver. Carter grabbed the radio microphone and relayed the observation to his commander, Lieutenant Grant. The lieutenant peered through his own scope, offered no reply, and passed the information up the chain of command. The response arrived a few minutes later. Do not engage until identity is verified. That was all. No additional information. Carter remained silent. He observed the vehicle again, now immobile at the edge of a small clearing, its crew partially visible. One man holding binoculars climbed onto the rear mudguard and surveyed the surroundings as if orchestrating movement. It was undeniably a command vehicle, but the rules were the rules. So Carter bided his time, his finger tapping a steady rhythm on the periscope's edge, as the clock moved inexorably toward the point where he would have to choose between obeying his orders and acting on what he was certain was true. The target presents itself. The woods were unnervingly still. The customary sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves had ceased, as if the very ground was in a state of suspense. Inside the Sherman, Elijah Carter remained with his gaze fixed on the gunner's scope, observing the German vehicle with the focus of a predator awaiting a single misstep. It wasn't advancing quickly, but rather inching through a break in the hedgerow with a deliberateness that bordered on nonchalance. That fact alone was telling. This was not a scout vehicle concerned with being detected. This was an asset that presumed it was secure. The German command vehicle, now clearly identifiable as a Panzerbefehlswagen, or command tank, had positioned itself near the junction. Its antenna rose high like a signaling mast, slender and moving with the wind. Two officers emerged from the hatch. One was holding a map case. The other had field glasses raised, surveying the tree line in the direction of Carter's position. They were completely unaware of being observed. Carter slowly lowered his head and reported it once more. Unarmed command variant observed. No primary weapon. Antenna confirmed. Two officers visible, requesting permission to engage. The answer came back a minute later, terse and impersonal. Negative. Await visual verification from reconnaissance. Hold your position. Do not fire. Carter gnawed on the inside of his cheek, the metallic tang of blood filling his mouth. Sweat ran from his helmet's chin strapped down his neck. He kept his eyes open. Through the sight, he saw the German officers gesturing toward the rear of their column. A Panzer IV moved forward, settling into position behind the command tank. Then a second one followed. They were not attacking. They were arranging themselves, preparing for an action. This signified only one thing: an impending assault. Carter had witnessed this maneuver once before, in a training documentary. The Germans utilized these mobile command tanks as battlefield coordination centers. When situated near the front lines, they served as the conductors of the armored force, directing fire, giving commands, and responding more swiftly than Allied formations could reposition. To eliminate the command tank meant the rest would either disperse or halt. He reached for the radio once more, pressing the button with greater emphasis this time. "Sir, this is Carter. I have a direct view of them. It is a Befehlspanzer, a command variant. There is no question." Lieutenant Grant's voice returned, calm, yet wary. "Stand down, Corporal. Higher command says to wait for recon. No exceptions." From behind him, the loader, Private Marsh, whispered, "Are you certain it is what you believe it is?" Carter offered no reply. He had no need to. Through his scope, he watched one of the German officers lift his hand and point squarely toward their left flank, toward the infantry route that was not yet secured. A second later, the panzers began to swivel their turrets in that direction. They were getting ready to attack. Time was running out. Every passing second brought them closer to an ambush. Carter let out a slow breath, his hand poised over the trigger mechanism. He was aware of the rules. He was aware of the repercussions. Firing without authorization could lead to a court-martial. Insubordination in a combat zone was not a matter the Army treated lightly. His entire military career, his very liberty, was at stake. But then, his thoughts turned to the infantrymen further down the road. Those without armored support, those still positioning machine guns in the hedgerows, completely unaware that 3 German tanks were preparing to advance directly upon them. He looked once more. The officer was still pointing, the antenna still swaying like a thin, defiant finger against the blue French sky. This was the decisive moment, the final safe second. Carter firmed his grip, made a minuscule adjustment to the elevation, and felt his breathing steady. Then he made his choice. The shot that broke the regulations. Elijah Carter's hand was unwavering. Despite the turmoil in his mind, the admonitions, the orders, the imagined voice of his drill instructor yelling, "Follow the goddamn chain of command," an inner quiet had descended upon him. It was a state of focus, the kind that arises only when one is about to take an irrevocable action. With deliberate precision, he reached down and turned the turret slightly, just a few degrees to the right. The command vehicle remained in place, parked as if it owned the entire road, its crew still gesticulating, still ignorant that a gunner 200 yards away had just determined their destiny. "Target acquired," Carter murmured to himself. Within the tank, no alarms blared, no sirens wailed, no dramatic fanfare, only a man and his trigger. He curled his fingers around the firing lever. It was warm from the sun, familiar, like the handle of a baseball bat from his youth. Then he pulled. The 75mm armor-piercing round exited the Sherman's barrel with a ferocious hiss, a blinding white flash, and a thunderous report that vibrated through the crew's bodies. The recoil of the gun caused the entire tank to shudder, its tracks shifting against the loose earth. Private Marsh flinched instinctively, shouting, "What in the hell was that?" Nobody replied. Carter had already returned his eye to the scope, following the projectile's path. He witnessed the shell in flight, a dark shape against the green and gold backdrop of the Normandy landscape, before it impacted the command vehicle directly on its side. For an instant, there was nothing. Then, a burst of flame. The explosion was not immense, not the Hollywood-style conflagration of fuel and metal fragments. It was more concentrated, more intense, more precise. The shell had penetrated the vehicle's lightly armored flank, igniting something within, perhaps the radio equipment, perhaps the fuel system. Fire erupted from the upper hatch. One of the officers was thrown out, collapsing lifelessly on the roadside. The other vanished in a flare of orange and smoke. The antenna snapped in two and fell like a fractured flagpole. Then came the shouting, not from Carter's crew, but from the German tanks positioned behind the wreckage. The Panzer-Fours were motionless. Their formation was in chaos. Their gunners were uncertain, unsure of what had just transpired. Lacking their command vehicle, they had no instructions, no guidance. Carter knew what had to happen next. He swiveled the turret toward the closest panzer and commanded, "Load high explosive now." Marsh, though still shaken, moved with purpose, seizing the next shell and ramming it into the breach. But he would not need to fire it. The German tanks started to pull back. It was not a complete rout, but a methodical, wary retreat back into the safety of the trees. The brain of their operation had been severed, and the rest of the body was left without direction. Inside the Sherman, silence reigned for several seconds. Even Lieutenant Grant, who had emerged halfway from the hatch, simply stared at the plume of black smoke ascending from the disabled vehicle. At last, he looked down at Carter. "You fired without orders," he stated. It was a statement of fact, not an inquiry. Carter looked up, his expression inscrutable. "Yes, sir." Grant was silent for a moment. Then he conceded, "Good shot," and descended back into the tank. The repercussions, the orders, and the consequences. The fire was still alight when the remainder of the unit reached them. By midday, infantry had advanced to take control of the crossroads, and the sounds of combat subsided into an unnatural calm. Smoke from the incinerated German command vehicle rose in slender black columns, twisting into the summer sky like ceremonial incense. The body of one officer was positioned face down beside the road. The other remained unaccounted for, likely consumed by the explosion. The Sherman's engine was off. Inside the tank, Carter sat with his back pressed against the steel hull, his breathing slow and even. No one addressed him, not immediately. Lieutenant Grant went to radio headquarters, leaving Carter and the others to themselves in the oppressive heat. Private Marsh, leaning on the turret, was the first to speak. "You actually went and did it, didn't you?" he said. Carter did not meet his gaze. "I did." Marsh let it drop. They were all aware of what would follow. Violating a direct command in a combat situation, regardless of intent, was a grave transgression. It could result in a reprimand at best, a court-martial at worst. The Army did not favor individual initiative. War was inherently chaotic, and the only thing preventing it from becoming a massacre was discipline. And yet, the events that had just unfolded were undeniable. The Germans had been preparing for an attack. The command vehicle Carter had eliminated had most likely been organizing an armored assault on the exposed left flank, a route that led directly to a field command center and a medical aid station. Had they launched their attack, the results would have been devastating. But none of this had been confirmed. Not at that point. Headquarters dispatched a jeep with 2 officers later that afternoon. They posed questions, captured photographs, and measured the depression left by the Sherman shell. They conducted interviews with the tank crew individually, Carter included. He stated the truth. He detailed what he had witnessed, the reasons he was certain the vehicle was a command variant, and the signs that had prompted him to take action. He recounted the officers disembarking, the antenna, the hand gestures, and the actions of the tanks behind them. One of the investigators acknowledged his account. The other simply recorded notes. Carter made no inquiries about his punishment. He did not have to. Later that evening, after the sun had set, Lieutenant Grant found him near the tent line. "They are not going to file charges," Grant informed him. His tone was subdued, his expression hard to read. No reprimand, no disciplinary hearing. Carter blinked. Nothing. They classified it as a tactically sound judgment call, made under circumstances of incomplete communication. The lieutenant let out a brief, mirthless chuckle. "Which I believe is their way of saying you saved our hides. But we'd rather you not make a habit of it." Carter breathed out for the first time in what felt like hours. He did not smile or nod, but simply gazed at the dark silhouette of the trees where the panzers had disappeared hours before. "Was it the correct decision?" he asked. Grant did not reply immediately. Then he said, "It was the only one that made a difference." Several days later, Carter was discreetly presented with the Bronze Star without any official recognition. The citation mentioned his initiative and resolute action in the face of an enemy maneuver. However, no press statement was issued, no newspaper articles were written, no radio interviews were conducted. It was merely a medal, placed in a box, overlooked by most, but not by the men who had been present on that day. They were aware of what had nearly transpired and what one gunner's choice had averted: the confirmation and the revealed evidence. 2 days after the smoke had settled, the true significance of Carter's action became apparent. not through commendation, but through tangible proof. The field engineers were the first to arrive. Their task was straightforward: to examine the area around the demolished command vehicle, catalog the wreckage, and collect any items of potential value to intelligence personnel. While Normandy was covered in the detritus of war, anything recovered from a command vehicle, particularly one disabled in the middle of an operation, was a significant find. The location was still charred. The steel hull of the Panzerbefehlswagen had buckled inward from the explosion. Its hatches were blackened, and its wheels were partially fused to the road. Yet, the antenna was unmistakable, now lying twisted and scorched several feet from the hulk. To an experienced observer, this was clearly not a standard tank. It was a mobile command post, its function evident from its design and equipment. What was discovered next validated everything. Within the partially destroyed chassis, engineers found a singed, but mostly intact field map. Its perimeters were burned, but the central portion was still readable. Lines drawn in pencil crossed a grid, marked with German military shorthand. Circles indicated timings, and arrows were aimed at American positions, one of which corresponded precisely to the location of Carter's tank and the nearby infantry supply convoy. The Germans had been planning a synchronized advance through the hedgerows at sunrise, with that exact road junction as their starting point. If Carter had waited for official confirmation, that vehicle would have relocated, likely to a more elevated position from which it could have directed artillery and armored units with superior visibility. The ambush, had it been executed, would have targeted supply routes, field medical stations, and an unprotected team of engineers setting up communication lines between battalions. The intelligence officer who examined the map wrote a one-line summary. Prompt action by Allied armor at Grid 07 prevented an imminent tactical breach. That Allied armor was Carter's Sherman. The report was passed discreetly up the chain of command. It did not create headlines or land on Eisenhower's desk, but within the 4th Infantry Division, its significance was understood. Back at the encampment, the news spread gradually. Other gunners started to acknowledge Carter with a nod as he passed. Some offered a salute. A few approached him during meals to inquire about what had alerted him, how he had been so certain. Carter never boasted. He never delivered a grand speech. He simply stated that the opportunity did not seem like it would last. Lieutenant Grant, who was typically a strict adherent to the chain of command, remained silent when Carter adjusted the Sherman's sights himself or bypassed standard briefing procedures. In a subtle, unspoken manner, the dynamic had changed. Carter was not exempt from the rules, but he had now demonstrated that sometimes the rules required a man who knew when to adapt. The command vehicle, or what was left of it, was hauled to the roadside by engineers. It remained there like a prize that no one wished to claim. Blackened, contorted, and silent, it stood as a testament to a decision that had no time for debate. For Carter, it was not a representation of victory. It was a cautionary tale. He would often look at it during patrols and reflect on how close he had been to inaction. How simple it would have been to obey orders, to remain safe, to await a confirmation that might have come 30 seconds too late. These thoughts did not torment him, but they also never left him. The burden of a single choice. In the ensuing weeks, the war progressed, unceasing and relentless, as if Normandy itself allowed no pause for contemplation. Villages were liberated, bridges were taken, and hills were captured and recaptured. Carter and his crew continued their advance inland with infantry units, as hedgerows yielded to open farmland and small hamlets marked by shell craters. Yet for Carter, one particular moment remained. It was not the detonation or the act of pulling the trigger that replayed in his mind. It was the silence of the 10 seconds before he fired, when time seemed to stretch thin, and the entire burden of the war appeared to settle on his shoulders. He often revisited it. What if he had paused? What if he had hesitated? What if he had convinced himself, "This is not my decision," and simply waited? He could have lived with that. No one would have held him accountable. The Germans would have pressed forward, perhaps undetected, until it was too late. Men would have been lost. Reports would have been written. The term enemy tactical advantage would have been typed in precise military script on someone's casualty report. And Carter would have had to sleep with that knowledge every night. That was the true burden. Not what he had done, but what he might have neglected to do. He never recounted the complete story to his crew. Not to Marsh. Not to the new radio man who came on after their previous one was injured in a shell explosion near St. Lo. They were aware of the basic facts, of course, as everyone was. But Carter held the finer points in confidence. The angles, the manner in which the German officer had pointed just moments before the shot, the reflection of sunlight on his binoculars, the instinct. He was not aiming for nobility. He simply did not want the incident to become a legend. One evening, several weeks later, as they were encamped near a dilapidated church outside of Veer, Lieutenant Grant sat beside him, uncharacteristically silent. "I reviewed that map again," the lieutenant stated. "We were positioned squarely in their path of attack. Your shot saved far more than just our crew." Carter gazed into the campfire. The flames danced, crackling softly in the still evening air. "I didn't do it for us," he replied. Grant glanced at him sideways. "Then for what reason?" Carter did not respond immediately. He stirred the fire with a stick, causing a few embers to ascend into the night sky, and then said, almost as if speaking to himself, "Because I could see it. What was on the verge of happening. Not what could happen, but what would. I sensed it, like a clear image in my mind." He remained silent for the remainder of the evening. In the months that followed, Carter would discharge his weapon dozens of additional times. He would disable tanks, destroy fortifications, and silence machine gun positions. He would contribute to the liberation of towns and bury comrades. But no other shot ever felt quite the same as that one. That single, unauthorized, unconfirmed, unrequested shot. It was the only one that ever felt distinctly personal. Years afterward, following the war, when Carter was back in Ohio, he maintained a small box in his closet. Inside was the bronze star he had never shown anyone, a faded picture of his tank crew, and a folded map, scorched at the edges, its German annotations still faintly discernible. He never explained its significance to his children, but occasionally, when they would ask him about his time in the war, he would pause, look off into the distance, and simply remark, "Sometimes you are given only one chance to do the right thing. The rest of your life is just an attempt to measure up to it." The battlefield is quick to forget. Burnt-out vehicles are removed, craters are backfilled, names disappear from sandbags and helmets. But the tactic that endures is when someone pays attention. In the weeks following the engagement at the crossroads, Carter's action became a quiet point of analysis, not in official strategy meetings or media reports, but in the low-toned discussions between officers as they inspected the lines at twilight. Command vehicles, or Befehlspanzer in German terminology, were seldom found at the front. They were valuable assets, crucial for the coordination of armored units. They were equipped with detailed maps, encrypted radios, and officers empowered to redirect entire battalions. The elimination of one such vehicle at the perfect moment, before the enemy's maneuver had fully materialized, brought something significant to light. Severing the head did not merely injure the snake, it caused the rest of it to disperse. In tactical terms, Carter's shot had disabled a critical node in the Wehrmacht's command structure, leaving German armored units disoriented, uncoordinated, and susceptible to counterattacks. Historians would later describe such events as localized decapitations, infrequent but highly effective disruptions of battlefield cohesion. Yet Carter never considered it in terms of military theory or historical significance. To him, it had been a gut feeling, a moment of absolute clarity amidst the chaos. Back in his hometown years later, long after the medals had been put away and his uniform was stored in the attic, he would think not about the shot itself, but about what it had taught him about his own character. He had been raised to trust systems, parents, schools, institutions, the military. He complied with orders not out of fear of repercussions, but from a belief in order, in the idea that those in positions above him had more knowledge, greater foresight, and had merited their authority. And yet, at that pivotal moment on June 11th, all the echelons above him had been unresponsive. No one else had perceived what he had. No one else had felt the gravity of the situation as he did, and no one else could have fired that weapon but him. This experience transformed him, not into a rebel, but into a person of deep responsibility. He no longer viewed rules as rigid boundaries, but as instruments, useful and necessary, but not without their flaws. He came to understand that true leadership is not about compliance. It is about discernment, the courage to take action when the established rules have not yet caught up with the reality of what is about to unfold. Over the years, Carter became a quiet proponent of this lesson. He did not author books. He did not deliver speeches, but he imparted it through his way of life, measured, perceptive, and willing to make difficult decisions when no one else would. In the war, he had been a gunner. In life, he became a moral compass. For those who knew him, Carter was a man of few words, but resolute actions. The type of individual who did not falter when assistance was needed, who listened more than he spoke, and who bore the unseen weight of having once prevented a catastrophe that no one else even knew was coming. No statue was erected in his honor. No public square was named for him. But among those who served alongside him, who owed their survival to him, his name required no inscription in stone. It resided in the memory of a single instant when one man perceived the truth before the system did, and possessed the fortitude to act on his own. Elijah Carter did not consider himself a hero. He never sought recognition, never requested to be memorialized. But in the silent, irreversible moment when intuition conflicted with procedure, he made a choice. Not because he was permitted to, but because it was the correct thing to do. That choice was not accompanied by fanfare, medals, or headlines. It was met with silence, with the burden of knowing that a single decision, made in a matter of seconds, had saved others from death, and had left an indelible mark on him. His lesson was this: sometimes the world will present you with a set of rules and demand your compliance. But the reality is, a day will come, perhaps just once, when your instinct knows something that the system does not. In that moment, inaction will feel like the safe option. But doing what is right may be the most solitary step you will ever take. Carter took that step, and while he carried the weight of it for the remainder of his life, he never once doubted his decision. Because courage is not always loud. It is not always found in the charge or the cheer.